You, how were your presentations today?
It was good, but really fun. I was explaining to Ludo that basically I was awake until 4 in the morning, sleep 4 hours, and then wake up to continue discussions. And now everybody's getting wasted in Sydney because the people can go outside to have drinks.
Okay,
They're allowed to go into bars. So yeah, I'm getting drunk messages while we talk. So
you can forward them the lecture afterwards.
Yeah,
exactly. To see the stream.
So no, but what's really good, it was fun. Of course, in the context of the strange semester we went through, we had to shift to online the second week. So we had a week of face-to-face. Second week, the university says stop everything. We have a week. We decide what we do after that week, and after that week, we decided everything is online. So none of the studios were prepared to do that, and they had to do it in a week, which, in a sense, was, I think, what's a good outcome, because everybody started with a lot of energy and saying like it's gonna be great. The level of exhaustion that we arrived to the end of the semester, I think it's been leveled with incredible amount of generosity and love. Everybody's so happy we're done, and it's like, yeah, we're finished, because it's been tough. I think, well, probably you noticed too, the teaching studio online is
and then and you go to break until the end of, for the next 5 weeks or 6 weeks or something.
The last week of July we start again,
and then that will for sure be online the entire semester, or that's not known.
It's terrible, but we don't know yet, which is amazing, right? Like, and I've been complaining about it. I was able, a month ago, I was able to get the masters, convinced that the masters will be, Kirsten, the masters will be a pilot program that will be able to do kind of face-to-face. Kersten, how are you?
Hi, Urtzi, I'm good. I will switch off my mic for a bit and follow you, because I'm also doing a professor meeting in Mendrisio in parallel. But in half hour I will be able to escape. So,
okay.
And then we can chat afterwards a bit better.
Yeah, let's do that.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
Too. Yeah.
Hi, Solomon.
Hello.
Yeah.
We didn't.
So that is the situation right now. Today we got an email from the provost saying that probably it's going to be more open than we thought. So it's not going to be only the masters, but it will be other programs. So let's see. I mean, the hope is to get everything open as soon as possible, because we cannot continue like this. Yes. The students are kind of saying that it's that they're missing too much, and that the majority of the learning actually happens in informal ways, not in talking with the teacher or something, and they need to be able to meet together. But the energy on the reviews was great. I think everybody was really happy, and it was a combination of surviving and being over, and the work has been great. Everyone has been really focused. So the amount of production has been impressive.
Yeah, it's good. A couple of weeks ago, I sat in on Kersten's. I was a voyeur for the diploma presentations. I thought they did a really nice job. Also, I mean, the presentation structure was rigid and it was good. So good projects, but it was still entertaining. So this is our final presentation week, and we've been streaming everything online, and we set it up more as conversation. But I think it was, well, I realized that it was harder maybe to engage in a conversation than if it would have been a kind of, presentation. Anyways, it's something to think about. But there's have you tested this Miro yet? Which is this kind of, I know Eteha has been using it. It's sort of like you literally like pin up or something like this. I don't know. This will be the kind
we use the equivalent that is called concept board. It's the same. Yeah, we've been using it all the time, and I think it saved our day, because it's the closest thing you can get to have a You can annotate the drawings. Everybody can be drawing at the same time in the same place. There is something about it that that allows to, I don't know, replicate to a certain extent what is happening in the studio.
Yeah,
But it's
great.
limited.
We're letting in all the students here, and then yeah, we can get started. I'll just do a little intro already. So, well, it's my pleasure. We'll do kind of two separate intros because since we have two separate lectures in reality. This is the fifth session of what's turned out to be a 7-part series entitled Building Competitions, which is looking at the processes. Why am I echoing? The maybe somebody. I think that's Kirsten. Is that possible? Your microphone?
Yeah, it's me. I switch off my mic. It's good. I'll let you speak. Yeah, otherwise you join the other meeting too. It's not so interesting. Okay.
And I know it's the echo from listening to the Mandrizio thing because there was that drama there before no, that's better. Sorry. So this is the completion of the building competition series, which has looked at a set of architectural competitions, in particular looking at them as sites of experimentation. And so we have had a whole bunch of historical case studies up until this point, from the Paris Opera House to Parc de la Villette. And then we thought that it would be great to somehow, to present let's say two contemporary competitions that in a sense, maybe history will see them as something canonical, like the Paris Opera House or Parc de la Villette. We do not know yet, but there's the Guggenheim Helsinki competition, and then in particular the Canal Pompidou competition in Brussels. So we thought that it was important to get, to have this kind of contemporary discussion and to open that up. And so we will kick off the fifth lecture in the series by Urtzi Grau, who is an architect. He is the director of the Master of Architectural Research at University of Technology, Sydney, and is co-founder of Fake Industries Architectural Agonism. Urtzi graduated from the School of Architecture of Barcelona. He graduated at Columbia's GSAPP, where we first met in 2004. And then he has completed his PhD studies at Princeton School of Architecture, which is looking at 1970s renewal. And it's a pleasure to give the floor to you, Urtzi, to present the Guggenheim Helsinki competition. And the floor is yours, and we look forward to the talk. So,
can you allow me to share the screen? I think
right now.
Yeah. Okay. Oops. There we go. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah. Thank you. Hi. Hello, everyone. I'm going to be talking about the Guggenheim Helsinki competition. The Guggenheim Helsinki competition was a competition organized in 2014 by Malcolm Redding, probably one of the most important companies organizing competitions around the world, architectural competitions, for the Guggenheim Foundation. It was organized between 2014 and running between 2014 and 2015. It was the result of a sort of a fiasco. The Guggenheim Foundation got an agreement with the mayor of the city of Helsinki to actually host a museum, to actually build a museum in the main kind of bay of Helsinki. A decision that was not necessarily well received by the municipality, by some of the members of the council, like Karin Taimpao, but others joined to kind of build a kind of a furious, kind of a strong position against Helsinki Guggenheim ever kind of being built in a public land with not a proper kind of public process. And as a result, Guggenheim decided to hire Malcolm Redding to organize international open public competition that will, in a way, validate the proposal for the building, but also kind of maybe align the way the building was going to get designed and built to kind of the standards of publicness that Finland has. The response not necessarily kind of convince all the kind of the positions against it, but in a way proposed that a massive competition that's going to be public with a jury of well-known architects such as Yoshi Tsukamoto, Juan Herreros, Ginny Gang, or Mark Wrigley, among others, and another half of the jury being local officials for the Department of Urbanism of the municipality and technicians, will look to any proposal arriving with a kind of a level of transparency that was never seen before in architectural competitions. That means that when the first stage of the competition finished, the Guggenheim released every single entry, showing that there was actually 1,715 entries to this museum, making it the largest competition in history. And also at the same time released the 6 finalists that were at the time still anonymous. So the names of the finalists were released and the projects were released, but were never linked to each other. So Hascor Cambridge, a local office, SMAR, a Spanish office based in Australia, ourselves, Fake Industries, that were also a Spanish office based in Australia at the time, Asif Khan from London, and AGFES from Switzerland, but also Morlau Kunsunki that were in Paris, right? But remember, those names were released, these images were released, but were never linked, and any attempt to identify your project meant disqualification. That kind of weirdness for all of us was immediately kind of met with a massive concern among the architectural community that I think is best summarized by this video. Let's see if it plays properly. There we go.
For over 75 years, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation has been breaking barriers in the promotion of visual culture. Its 3 museums in New York, Venice, and Bilbao have changed the architectural conception the world over. And before laying even the first stone, Guggenheim Helsinki is already reforming the landscape of international design through the colossal volume of project submissions it's received. But when we say colossal, how do we put that into perspective? Let's start with an individual submission. Each design submission required 2 A4-sized pages, 4 A1-sized boards, and 1 USB containing the project in its entirety. A relatively reasonable amount of work, no? But with a record-breaking 1,715 submissions, we have 6,860 A1-sized boards, each individually measuring 841 millimeters tall and 594 millimeters wide. That spread horizontally would reach a total length of over 4,000 meters, which would take an average adult man more than an hour to walk. Arranged vertically, it'd be 5,769 meters tall, or higher than all of the mountains in Europe. And if spread across the surface, it'd be nearly 3,500 meters square, filling over 3 Olympic swimming pools. Even piling the boards on top of one another would be taller than 6 giraffes, and they'd weigh almost 3,000 kilograms, about the same as a delivery van. But what about the time needed to review every entry? Let's assume the judges dedicate 5 minutes to every project. That would mean the judges would end up spending 8,500 minutes together, or 142 hours, nearly 18 days. If we add to that the 47.5 hours it would simply take to read each concept description, it would take about a month working 8-hour days to get through everything. Let's hope the judges all get along. And if we want to talk about money, taking an ideal architectural team with the senior architect, 2 juniors, and an intern working for a month on their proposal, and using average salaries from the Royal Institute of British Architects, we'd be looking at an amount of work valued at over 10,000 euros. If we multiply that by all the submissions received, Guggenheim is sitting at over 18 million euros worth of work. A third of all the designers involved have even agreed to apply a Creative Commons license to their work. This license will enable free distribution and manipulation of otherwise copyrighted designs. This collective effort is colossal. It is historic. It shows the tendencies and the importance of design in the 21st century. Almost 20 years ago, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao united critics, academics, and the general public around Franco Gehry's building, a rare moment in architectural history. Global interest in and media coverage of the new museum helped create an emotional response towards it, desire. The new Guggenheim helped put Bilbao on the global art map, increasing tourism wildly after its completion. And obviously, many cities followed its lead. The Guggenheim Bilbao rose to become the peak of a new architectural tendency, having Gehry as the very first of the so-called starchitects. Nowadays, digital media has increased the speed with which we consume architecture, giving access to media coverage to nearly every architect in the world, providing architecture with a new powerful weapon, instantaneous feedback from the general public. Social networks help to quickly spread knowledge around the world, producing countless views, downloads, comments, shares, likes, dislikes, data. New parameters to measure architecture, reducing the distance between its designers and users. All 1,715 entries to the Guggenheim Helsinki design competition were shared with the public, allowing everyone to consider every single proposal. Before a winner has even been announced, Guggenheim Helsinki is already generating an immense amount of feedback in the form of articles, debates on urbanism, economy, architecture, and also parallel competitions, reviews, and all kinds of opinions. The Bilbao effect transformed architecture worldwide through a tendency that lasted for almost 20 years. Will the Helsinki effect be capable of turning architectural conception once again upside down?
Taller de Casquería, the authors of the video, kind of summarize probably the reasons why the next few weeks and months after the release of the 1750 entries meant kind of a massive discussion within the field of architecture. First of all, the internal resistance towards the construction of a new museum in Helsinki didn't weaken, but actually increased, and lead to the release of a parallel competition that will happen at the same time that the second stage of competition was happening. That is called Planning for the Next Helsinki. Penny Dimmer wrote kind of an article in the Avery Review identifying the competition of Helsinki as the kind of the pinnacle of the introduction of neoliberal politics in the production of architecture, but also denouncing the architects' inability to recognize how they were being exploited and how they love to be self-exploited. Aaron Bensky, on the other hand, pushed for almost an opposite kind of reading, and in an article in Architect called Guggenheim Finalists Meh, claimed that the architecture that was being proposed was absolutely boring and what didn't lack any kind of formal or architectural qualities, and even kind of some of the projects that were presented don't even have a building to deal with. Per Victoria Relli, on the other hand, claimed that the Guggenheim competition was the demonstration that competitions only increase homogeneity and a kind of a kind of a singular thought, in a way, with that screen full of 1,715 renderings that were almost indistinguishable. They were all the same. They were basically a kind of an hegemonic image of architecture that was not kind of acceptable. And the comments of Ren Koolhaas around competitions being the worst thing that had happened to architecture ever would resurface and were circulated among all the blogs. Of course, comments that are always kind of appalling, especially for an office that makes their life in a kind of competitions. But more important maybe is that after the second stage was announced, Russia invade a section of Ukraine, triggering kind of a series of sanctions that pushed for the massive or the largest devaluation of ruble in recent history, which collapsed the economy of Russia and stopped all of a sudden all the kind of tourism of Russian tourism to Helsinki, which was absolutely key for the project, right? Because what it was not written in the brief is that Helsinki was probably the closest place where Guggenheim could build a museum that was still in Europe but close enough from Russia to actually kind of take advantage of Russian tourism and Russian money. With this devaluation that happened really exactly at the same time that the competition was unfolding, the tourism from Russia to Helsinki stopped completely, kind of producing two clear effects. The viability of the project immediately get into big doubt, but also put Finland itself into a recession, question even further the necessity of having a piece of infrastructure or the US-based museum placed in the center of the city and kind of increasing the resistance of the community to the project. Of course, our proposal was both prepared and presented and selected in the absence of that knowledge, or or kind of separated to from any control we can have about these things. Was a proposal that only recognized that situation once we were selected for the second phase. The proposal was quite straightforward. It basically recognized that Helsinki is a city of interiors, opposite to the Mediterranean paradigm of the street, at the space of civic life, at the space of politics, at the space or of social life. Helsinki, due to its kind of extreme climatic conditions, is a city of endless indoors that actually work as the place in which these things that usually happens in the street in Mediterranean cities happen, right? Because of these conditions, the streets of Helsinki are full of people a few weeks a year. The rest of the time, the body politics of the city happens in places like this ones. I'm showing places that are all over the city that are kind of heavily populated, and they define the publicness of Helsinki. We identified many of those. We try to understand how they work, how they connect to each other, how that public life constructs the city, and we end up proposing a Guggenheim straightforward transformation of the way they are conceived themselves. Historically, if the profile of buildings like the one in New York or the one in Bilbao was the value that and the way in which Guggenheim was defining itself in front of the city that they were based on, we propose that they shift that sectional quality for a hydrographic diagram, the diagram that links humidity and temperature to identify zones of climatic control, and make clear to Guggenheim that the only way to actually be linking with the society of Helsinki will be to actually understand that the publicness in Helsinki is linked more to climatic comfort than to kind of iconic gestures, right? And we propose literally that, a museum that will be defined not necessarily by its image, but rather by its climatic conditions inside. Proposing a museum that, as you can see here, will have a variety of climatic conditions organized in a series of onion rings with one single room that will basically deal with all the climatization systems. The big room where we'll have the traditional art, and then the rest of the rooms that will be placed in a series of semicircles around it will be heated and controlled climatically through spills, through leakage of temperature. So the front door will be slightly warmer than the outside. When you go through the entrance and get into the shop in which you're going to buy some things when you're getting in or out, it will be slightly warmer and slightly less humid. And little by little, room by room, you will get into the area that has the right climatic conditions. That effect that works both in plan and in section will define a project that was made of containers, of rooms that had only one single purpose, to be able to control the leakage of climatic conditions. So the qualities of these rooms were constructed around this ability to insulate, this ability to be able to control how much climatic comfort is leaking from one to each other. 47 rooms that obviously identify one single element as the most important one: the doors, the place in which those leakages are always going to happen. And we turn into commercial doors to identify which were the doors that will allow us to control those leakages. And of course, one has to immediately look at kind of wholesale markets and kind of doors that are used to maintain massive black boxes that have refrigerated these interiors in its own temperature, massive doors of Berlages that open and close fast enough to maintain the temperature inside continuous. The proposal, of course, seemed not to be enough. Even if kind of climate became the kind of the driver for the project, we thought that Helsinki also contained probably the most radical public space, and it was beyond the fact that it was interior. It was a public space that probably defies all the conventions of Western public space, and that is the sauna, right? And it's not only because the sauna is a space in which a bunch of people lay naked close to each other for long periods of time, basically challenging kind of conventions of privacy and intimacy. But it probably was more radical for us because it's a shared space in which the public, the users, share decisions around climatic comfort. And they do it in a really simple way, right? The technical device, the kind of the little kind of a stove in the sauna is not something that is mechanically kind of controlled, but rather a kind of a device that is being socialized as the place in which, through pouring water, you change the amount of humidity of the room and immediately and radically change the conditions of comfort of the room. And that kind of pouring is actual a social negotiation, a continuous negotiation, because of course if someone starts pouring too much water, will basically kick out everyone from the sauna. And that seems to be an incredible value, right? A place in which society has been trained not only to kind of mobilize public spaces inside, but actually has been trained to manage the climatic conditions of those interiors. That was the second idea that we want to throw into the proposal. What would happen if Guggenheim not only imagine itself as a series of climatized spaces or a range of climatic comfort zones, but also that will give a certain level of control of those climatic control zones to the visitors of the building. That problem that in the sauna is resolved with the stove, in a museum, of course, is slightly more complicated. We envision a series of mechanisms that will maintain a kind of a limits of what the variation of climatic comfort could be. A kind of a roof with FTE cushions and a double layer. We also will have inside all the lighting and all the air conditioning necessary to maintain the kind of let's say a red line of climatic conditions define each of the rooms, right? Like in a sauna, of course, you cannot go below a certain temperature. There is limits, even if there is certain control given up to the users. This cushion had not only the ability to control, but also have spatial capabilities. For example, it will disappear in certain rooms in moments in which the weather outside will be acceptable for the museum. But more important, within each of the rooms, a series of mechanisms that in this case were closer to the stove of the sauna, little greenhouses that will kind of produce self-contained climates that were slightly different from the one in the room, or pieces of thermic furniture that will take advantage of the geothermic conditions of the site and produce almost bubbles of different temperature kind of a system that I just missing a slide here, a system in which kind of the building itself will be able to recognize the values and the comfort levels that the users will kind of insert, and then will be readjusting itself to actually kind of achieve the levels of comfort of each user was proposed. This kind of radical proposal, so to say, was also kind of explained around the fact that maybe Guggenheim was not so far from these ideas already, right? When one looks at Guggenheim and the different buildings of Guggenheim, obviously in the one identifies the classical galleries, the ones that one can find in the upper levels of the Guggenheim New York, right? The ones that host all the masterpieces of 1920s avant-garde, and those rooms, as any museum in the world, have a really tight climatic condition. Probably you're aware that a museum anywhere in the world has to maintain 24/7 all year long really specific climatic conditions, 21 Celsius degrees, 51% humidity. If it's not the case, the insurance policies stop working, and the rest of the museums stop sharing art with that museum. It's a standard that was set up in the 1970s and haven't been challenged since, which has been also kind of an issue that has been heavily or has been a kind of a source of strong polemics, because of course when it was set up in the 70s, the range of museums that agree in those conditions were located in a really specific climatic zone, let's say also in a really specific cultural zone, and with explosion of museums or cultural institutions in other areas of the planet that don't necessarily have the same climate. Climatization in museums in places such Helsinki or in arid or more warmer climates becomes the larger expenditure for any building, right? Because of course, to maintain a building with 21 Celsius degrees at 51% relative humidity 24/7 in Helsinki is quite complicated. And but anyway, so Guggenheim had those rooms, but then when one looks at more other spaces in the actual buildings of Guggenheim, like for example the big atrium in the Guggenheim Bilbao or the massive room for the Serra pieces, one understands that maybe due to the size of these rooms, but also for the kind of art they are hosting, 1970s pieces, those standards of kind of climate are slightly more relaxed. To maintain the stratification of air makes almost impossible in an atrium that is as high as the one in Bilbao or the one in New York to maintain the temperature. And actually, in pieces like, for example, the Guggenheim Lab, the kind of the section of Guggenheim that Atelier Bauval designed and that was installed in New York and later in India, those notions of having enclosure and climatic conditions were completely dismissed in favor of kind of logics of art that were more connected with relational aesthetics. So actually, one could claim that actually the museum, without being aware of, was already engaging in a kind of a range or kind of producing a range of climatic conditions already. And our proposal is basically taking the range of climatic conditions and in a way extending, but not only standing up and kind of having a menu of climatic conditions, different rooms, different climates, but also proposing that climate, temperature, and humidity will become part of the toolkit of curatorial work, right? What will happen if climate, probably the last frontier of criticism against the white box, right? Like the qualities of neutrality of the white box through the 70s were dismantled. Any idea that a white box is neutral because of its lighting or because of the wide nature of those walls or the autonomy in relationship with the environment was completely kind of dismantled and undermined through the discussions of the 70s and 80s. But somehow climate, the fact that art needs to be experienced on 21 degrees Celsius and 51 degrees of relative humidity was still considered untouchable, right? Any of you, if you gone into a museum, or you've been looking at a kind of a piece of art, you've been experiencing always in those conditions. So what will happen is a museum kind of decides to challenge that last frontier of so-called objectivity, kind of the way in which art is experienced, and accepts kind of climate change or changing the climate of the museum, sorry, as a tool that could be part of the experience of art. That hypothesis was kind of contrasted with a series of art curator, Chus Martinez, at the time in the Museo del Barrio, which kind of point out at the fact that sorry. That we needed to be really careful about that, but also that actually there will be one of the right tracks to kind of increase or kind of extend the ability of the museum to be relevant again, and actually witness a McCartney piece on really cold conditions would completely transform the experience in a new spaces. Or Pedro Garaño, the time was at MoMA, still kind of being the creator of architecture, talking about the fact that materialities and transformation of museums and flexibility will be deeply impacted by these kind of conditions. Or maybe Maurice Kuhn from Barcelona being the one that kind of claim or let us know that probably that tool was not for the curators, so kind of who has become the dictators of museums, but actually for the artists to experience, right? That's actually opens up a space of production of art that is worth exploring, but not necessarily in the hands of the curators, but in the hands of the artists. And that kind of lead us to probably one of the things that we are more proud of, but also one of the things that made our project not successful at the end. That is how to show this project, how to show the interior of a project that is only made of interiors, but an interior that will be populated by art that we don't know how it is, because it will be an art that is produced when artists operate using climatic conditions as part of the work, right? So the series of images that were also heavily criticized, both by critics like Aaron Bensky, but also by the jury itself, who claims that the project in the final report that the project is great, but it will be great to figure out how it looks like. Basically announce a museum that will be full of things and stuff that we don't know how it look like, because literally the museum will be unknown. The museum will be a museum that is left when the climate enters the museum. So that is more or less my presentation. Maybe it's been a little bit too fast, but I think this is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Urtzi. Well, the students usually take on the questions at this point, but as they start to turn their cameras back on and think about questions, I just maybe wanted to start with, for you and the office, what were the after effects of this competition? Were there after effects, either professionally or even intellectually in other work?
Mm-hmm. Yes and no. It was, the aftermath of the competition was also quite messy. As I mentioned before, the transformation, the kind of geopolitical movements had incredible effect in the competition. The office also was not necessarily an office at the time. It was a collaboration between 6 different people. The office, Cristina, myself, Jorge López Conde in Madrid, Carmen Blanco in Australia, Alvaro in Australia, Madrid, and a series of collaborators in different places in the world. So the effect was one of maybe exhaustion. The the idea that this project will kind of produce kind of an increase of commissions, for example, or calls, never, I have to admit, never happened. It was really interesting to get to see from close Malcolm reading. That, you know, I don't know how many people is familiar with Malcolm reading, but probably any conversation about competitions in the last 5 years have to address who are they and why are they and what they do. So what I aware of is other people in the competition build up a relationship with Malcolm Reading that lead to a series of other competitions. That was not our case. We had a series of fantastic kind of events through the end section of the competition. One of the most interesting one was a collage that I'm sorry I cannot show that used a bunch of images of the interior of another museum and Photoshop it and, you know, put it together. And when we submitted the competition, we got an email from Malcolm Reading saying that one of the someone from a museum have complained that some images of the interior of his museum were being used to actually illustrate the interior of the future museum of Guggenheim. We explained that that's how collage works, that you take things and you put them together to actually build that. And they say that was inadmissible, of course. You cannot use the work of other people to illustrate yours. We tried to have a kind of an intellectual argument around the value of copying and production architecture. And we were the answer was basically during the deliberations of the jury, that images will be covered with a black rectangle, so they won't be able to see it because they cannot look at that image, which is, you know, like there is a little series of beautiful moments like those ones, maybe kind of help to not get more invitations. But I think in that sense, in the professional sense, it stopped there. In the personal sense, of the development of ideas of the office was incredibly important, right? It literally, the competition like this one, give us a space, time, and almost the necessity or the kind of the awareness that we need to produce a proper kind of argument around what we were doing and identifying clearly what the line of research was. In this case, how we actually operate with climate inside of a museum. And that actually has led to other kind of questions and other spaces that that have been part of our practice.
And then, sorry, just to piggyback on that, in reflection, would you do it again? In the sense that there's a sort of always a kind of nostalgia, maybe for the architectural competition as the way to jumpstart an office, jumpstart test collaborations amongst different colleagues who maybe you've never worked from before. You know, there's this kind of myth of the competition, especially in architecture school, that that, you know, this is the way to jumpstart something. And in that sense, in hindsight, yeah, would you do it again or would you not? And then we can open it up to the students for a few questions before moving to Kirsten. Yeah.
It's a great question. I had to admit, when I didn't want to do this competition. It's actually Alvaro, a friend of mine, told me, let's do something, let's do it. And I was like, I don't think it makes sense to submit anything to a competition that is going to have more than 300 entries. Then you end up having 1,700. On the other hand, I'm a big fan, and I'm a kind of like I defend competitions as one of the most important pillars of architectural culture. And we, after the entire process was over, respond to Peggy Dimmer's, I think, outrageous claims around competitions. And I'm a kind of a absolute defender of competitions. Obviously, there are better competitions and worse competitions. It's like everything in life. But I think competitions not only can define culture of architecture historically, probably the majority of the projects that have been meaningful in the history of architecture are organized around competitions, not all of them, but a big chunk of them. And many of the ones that never got built because they didn't kind of become the first prize in the competitions are the ones that actually we look at them continuously, and they exist precisely because competition exists. So I think to transform the discussion around competition to discussions around optimization of resources and kind of labor kind of appropriation is quite misleading in a way. You kind of misunderstand the way architecture culture is being produced and is still being produced, and how it actually, in a kind of a weird nostalgic way, kind of refuses to engage with models of production that other spaces and other fields in creative arts have been completely involved with, and it's questions around sharing, around kind of basically relationship of masters and students. There's a series of things that somehow architects have been able to maintain a status of anachronistic kind of a profession in a way, and I think competition is one of them. And again, these things are in danger, and I think, for example, Malcolm rating is one of the things that put them in danger for the way it works. But at the same time, still really important competitions around the world that allows to produce things that won't happen in any other way. And I think things like historically for the last, for example, the last 20 or 30 years, something like Europan kind of is a competition that is linked head to head to the construction of a social democracy and middle class. And, imagining that architecture is not something that only you can produce if you have healthy friends, wealthy friends, not healthy, right? So I think competitions are key, and I want I don't think it's just a myth. I think it's kind of one of the kind of principles of architecture, and I think they're endangered species. The kind of the discourse around architecture competitions as a forms of neoliberal agendas are basically undermining something that historically has been exactly the opposite.
Excellent. Is there a couple of questions from you guys before we move on? Yeah, Juan?
Yeah, thank you for the lecture. I haven't seen that video that transforms all data and numbers into giraffes and pools. It's always tempting to do those kind of comparisons. I was wondering if your thoughts on, we have seen a lot of competitions within the semester. We have seen the Paris Opera House, Palace of the League of Nations, the Chicago Tribune Tower. And in these three competitions, within the submission guidelines, there is a demand for evenness, for all submissions to have the same kind of drawing, the same kind of representation, one panel, one text, all images rendered in black and white. There are this kind of ideas of evenness that somehow in the last 50, 60 years shifted towards competition entries being much more personalized and much more aestheticized by architects, which also leads to canonical images like Parc de la Villette's entry from OMA. So I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on the conditions of today, in which you receive 1,700 entries, everybody with each rendering, but then many entries add diagrams and look for other forms of representation that also are a consequence in having totally different ways of representing, and very difficult task to even have comparable entries, to have to being able to even make a fair decision because of the disparity between entries and content.
Well, yeah, but there was a certain level of consistency last year. It was really loose. And but basically they had to, I don't know, like 6 horizontal A1s. That was basically it. And I think it was saying like something like urban proposal images or something like that. There was like kind of a loose thing. We misread it, and our first submission to the first stage were portrait oriented, but not because we wanted, but simply because there was like, I don't know, 100 pages, and it was like, okay, 6 A1s, and you start doing it and things like that. And nothing happened. We actually were selected. the kind of the, it's an interesting question. I mean, when I hear Vittorio really talking about the competition, was saying like they all look the same, right? That actually what happened with this apparent kind of freedom of you can put whatever is that what you get is a lot of renderings that more or less look the same. We refuse to make any renderings out of, you know, basically laziness, but also lack of not wanting to invest anything in the renderings in the first stage. So we did this collab. Well, actually, what we did is we call a friend of ours a week before the submission and send him a bunch of written descriptions of the rooms. And he is an artist. He produced this series of images, and we send them back. We look at them. We realize they didn't fit any of our descriptions, so we kind of work with it. And it become a kind of a system of explore certain things. So yeah, I think when one enters a competition like this one, what it gives you is not a chance to win, because it's obviously a lottery. To get selected between 170, 100 people is not even a proof of anything. It's just basically chance, right? As you know, it's clear in the video, the jurors haven't looked at you know, they cannot look at the proposals. It's completely impossible. It's just chance. So what it gives is kind of a level of freedom to taste things, to try things that, you know, it's a good excuse to do it. That's it. And in that sense, I think that looseness in the representation is great, but also historically, competition has been won by basically challenging and almost kind of folding or kind of moving around the rules that they're set up, right? And the League of Nations, in the case of Le Corbusier, is the classic one. Like he decides to draw it with ink, and it's not supposed to be. Therefore, he wins and loses at the same time, right? This is kind of. But I mean, you can go through a history of competition, seeing how many people has basically decide not to follow the brief to actually win. And the brief could be the brief of the project or the regulations of the competition. I think that's part of the game, how much you push it and how much you kind of mobilize. But I think not necessary. I mean, I imagine that competitions have to be scientifically evaluated because everything is drawn in the same way will be slightly naive, right? I mean, it's always good to have plans that are all the same scale, but all of us sit in reviews every semester, and you kind of confronted with a variety of things, and you need to be able to answer. And one of the pieces through which architects convince that the project they're doing is good is to actually have control over the means of representation.
I have a question. I was wondering, now that you touch upon the brief part, I was wondering if in context like this, with such an important driving project, why are they not quite articulated with the city itself? Did the basis of the contest share a liability study or a concern beforehand to take it place? Because there was this other case of a Guggenheim cancellation in Guadalajara. So it became at the end quite polemical as well.
The Guggenheim Helsinki was, in a way, a reaction to the series of cancellations all around the world of Guggenheim projects. Right, that was literally the last one. We need to be able to build this one, and the competition tried to actually build contextual kind of quality, not necessarily by having a kind of a massive understanding of the city in morphological terms, but rather in trying to build up a sort of democratic process, transparent democratic process that will be in tune with the culture of decision making in the city like Helsinki, which is incredibly sophisticated. I mean, that was one of the best experience we had, being there, talking with the kind of the city hall and all it's like incredibly public. So you will get into a cab from the airport, a taxi from the airport to the city center, and we will have a discussion with the taxi driver about the cost of the proposal Guggenheim, which is like, what? Why do you know these things? I mean, it's like really, really incredibly kind of entangled, but also this idea that a discussion of an investment, a public investment of this scale, is not something that happens because a couple of people in the cities in the municipality decided, but it's actually a concern that is a public concern, right? So in that sense, I think the effort was in that direction. And Guggenheim, historically an institution that has been quite opaque, right? All these projects had Guggenheim Bilbao, direct commission, is paid, a majority of money comes from actually public funds in Spain. And that's, it works like McDonald's. The city has to pay for the building, for the site, and a fee to actually keep the name of Guggenheim on the building. And Guggenheim basically gets paid a fee, a yearly fee. And also, if you want to get any exhibition from Guggenheim, you also have to pay. So, right, like it's like full-on business model. So I think it was closer to that. Of course, the brief had also kind of a series of sociological studies about the city, but it was not necessarily a kind of a deep kind of interaction with the city. And the site itself, by being placed by the water in an area that was used historically for big ships to stop by, also was in itself slightly disconnected. It was not like, an urban site. It was basically on the edge of the water.
Thank you. We'd like to, we will continue the conversation later and maybe hopefully expand some ideas, but let's now move to the seventh and final lecture in our series, which is given by Kirsten Hares. Well, Kersten is a partner of the Brussels-based office, Kirsten Hares and David van Severen. He is the Kenzo Tange design critic in architecture at Harvard's GSD, and he is also a professor at the Architecture Academy of Mendrisio in Switzerland. I have asked Kersten in this series to, well, basically not only present the Canal Center Pompidou competition as a kind of recent competition, but also to interrelate it with other projects that have come in the office. So in particular, the RTS project, which is currently under construction in Switzerland, which came before the Canal Pompidou competition, and to interrelate how basically competitions well, are opportunities for an office to investigate an idea of, well, let's say formal language or spatial language, and etc. So at any rate, it's a pleasure to have Kersten back at the Berlage as always. Unfortunately, it's not in person, but thank you for concluding the series for us, and we look forward to your presentation. So, and
thank you, Sam. Thanks a lot. Sorry, you wanted to say something.
I know. We do, Ludo. I think we need to give him access to share screen or something like this.
Well, I'll try it myself. Maybe.
Okay.
Does that work? Yes. Looks like that. Sure. Yes. You see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Here we go. Well, so it's shared. Oh, amazing. Huh? I must say, after 3 months of Corona, I still have no clue how it works with all these programs. But so far, so good. Well, first of all, Salomon, thanks a lot for inviting me. It's a pleasure, really. It's also funny in many respects to have Urtzi here as well. I mean, I think in a long time we saw each other, no, isn't it? And at the same time, I think we've spent quite a beautiful time at Columbia at a certain time. And there has been plans to go to Sydney, but it doesn't seem to work out. So maybe one day we manage together. I don't know, I decided to give a rather messy lecture. I mean, I thought that was correct. I mean, in the more or less intimate context which Salomon here is creating. So the theme being competitions, and perhaps the alibi being the project in Brussels, or the competition, the lost competition in Brussels for the Canal Museum, or the new Pompidou in Brussels, or whatever you call it, was perhaps an interesting alibi to talk about two projects, which in the end, I believe, are intertwined. But of course, this is artificial, as everything in architecture is artificial. And as to a certain extent, if I would have made other couples, it would have perhaps worked too. Now, having said this, after this internationalist, hyper-ambitious, 100,000 entry type of competition, which my dear friend Urtzi just presented. Here come two provincial competitions with a limited amount of people who enter them with no significance whatsoever on the international scene. However, they are about architecture, which is perhaps also not so bad. And not only that, of course, every project is about many things, but I believe what the two projects or the two competition entries from our side share is, despite the fact that they have very different, I would say, programmatic demands. I mean, there are different functions if you would express in these terms, one a museum and the other one a radio television building. I guess for both projects, our desire was to contemplate on how, to a certain extent, you can make city with a building. Making city being the title. Now, what I wanted to do is I wanted to share very much in a kind of a click fashion the very first panels, and there were 4 in total of the actually 3 or 4 stage RTS competitions. So there was an application with an image, which I'll show later, a perspective. And then, I don't think I've ever showed these, by the way. And then there were 4 panels in stage 1, when we were left with 8. And then there was a stage 2 and a stage 3 where we were still with 8, but then in the end we had to convince the client in a kind of an exchange a procedure which took probably 8 months. So the first 4 panels were these, and it's interesting, I looked them up, and that's the 4 of RTS, and I didn't look at them for probably 6 years or so, because the competition is about 6 years ago. So these 2 and these 2. And they're quite fascinating, I find, because they, to a certain extent, they show the building as we wanted it to be. It was very much, I would say, about figures and schemes in order to convince the people that although we were by far the youngest, intelligent enough to make such a, in a way, complex building. I mean, I'll explain the building later, but I mean, I would say, what's important perhaps here is to see these kind of words like emergence, which is kind of something like higher objects, which are also sometimes called magnets in some of these schemes, and champ, which is a big kind of endless space, which is in this other rectangle you see on the lower left corner both, and then this kind of ear-shaped figure with, in that moment, still 5 emergence, 5 objects. And then the references, the metaphor, as we call them, on the upper right corner. So that's the RTS set of panels. And then the Canal set of panels. So, I mean, they're the panels as we made them together with Chris Gantenbein, because that competition entry we made together with them, also with Bas Metz. I mean, Bas Metz also joined at a certain point the RTS building. Probably I'll mention that later, but if I would forget, I'll mention it now. The Canal panels, I think there were not 4, but 8 in total. And there was, of course, a 1 stage. I mean, there were 2 stages. You had to put a candidature, but then the moment you were in, there was only one entry and 1 presentation. So here you will see the panels. What I found interesting, and it's purely an observation, is how much more, I would say, mainstream already these panels. It also quickly changes 4 years in between or so, and then you see the panels are even more direct and simpler. So here you see these. So you see the figure of the building. You see, to a certain extent, also again this type of, you could say, emergence, although we didn't call them like this at all. This kind of higher figures. And you see, of course, this hall, which in this case is not designed but found. Good. So, in a certain way, I wanted to start, I would say, historically. So, what I just presented as RTS, Radio Télévision Suisse, in fact, was born as Project 176, because all projects have a number and it gives a little bit of kind of relative position where they are and what we do. I mean, of course, of all 176 numbers, probably 25 or so get built, and then the other 150 not. But okay, this is how it is. This is practice. And this was the collage we made to put the candidature. So it was an open call. You had to kind of make, you had to suggest a scheme in some way. I mean, on one A4 panel or an A3, I don't remember. You had, and you had to do that, I think, with a plan and a perspective. So that was the plan and a perspective somehow, and that was the plan. You had to explain why you thought you were a good candidate. So it went. This is the site. The site was the same for everybody. It's quite close to the lake. It's on the campus of EPFL on the left and the top, and on the right, it looks a little bit looser and more open, more grass. It's the campus of Roel, so it's in a way two university systems which somehow cohabit on this place. There's what you call pavillionaire, which is small houses in front, which are facing the lake. And then there's this, well, the learning center by Sana, this big rectangle with the ovalish openings. And then there's this very weird building. No, you cannot even describe the shape. It's not a triangle. It's kind of a, what is it? It's a triangle with a curved side and then a side tower. It's just below the ear shape of our building, as you can see it here, which is an existing building which somehow cuts out a part of this otherwise more or less rectangular site for the competition. So what was the question? And I show it now here on plan. The question in the competition was to design a building for the radio and television. And to do that, knowing that radio and television had negotiated land on this site, it was quite particular. I think we're talking now 2014, probably started preparing the whole competition 2012, 13. It was the era of the MOOCs, which perhaps came back since the last 3 months. Before was actually short-lived. So every university wanted to invest in broadcasting and broadcasting teaching. So they thought it was very interesting to have a radio television building on their site, so they would probably collaborate. So that was a win-win situation. The land was not used. At the same time, it would kind of give good idea for representation on how, I would say, progressive the EPFL and UNIL as universities are. And at the same time, it would have to be a building which somehow understands that it kind of enters this very odd campus-like world. So if you look at this plan, the top of it looks a bit like a switchboard, a kind of chipboard, a motherboard, a whole set of buildings from the 70s and 80s, which are very much interconnected, often on the second floor level. On the what is it on the left, on my left, so probably is that your left of all of us of the drawing, you see this diagonal on a development which has happened rather in the early 90s, and in the early 2000s they make the lower left these kind of squares. You can see kind of all fashions of urbanism. Of course, from the early 2000s onwards, the zone in which also our building is supposed to fit was the embrace of the landscape as won by Sana for the learning center. Of course, is the emblematic idea of architectural landscape. And then on the left of that, a very long roof under one roof, it's called back in Puma. Now, for us, what we're intrigued by as a problem was that we felt we had to make campus life, so we had to make buildings very much somehow representative by the UNIL side on the right. And at the same time, we had to understand that we were somehow fitting the legacy of these kind of horizontal buildings. So we wondered, is it possible to make a building which is at the same time champ, you could say interior field, as it is emergence, to use a French word, or kind of box or object. So can you make buildings, boxes, and field at the same time? So here you see a plan of the competitions. These are all the competition plans, the final ones. So stage 3, I showed you very quickly, as I said earlier, stage 1. So when we applied, 8 months later, we made this whole set. So the drawings you just saw, these drawings from the initial pitch of a, I don't know, an ear-like shape. It somehow vaguely fits on the side, allows the building on the lower right side to survive. I mean, that was simply a given. And a set of higher buildings which would somehow negotiate with that. we came to the final form in the competition, which was a set of boxes, two, I would say, big boxes on the right, which house all kind of studios immediately accessible by trucks and cars to do recording and to deliver studio material, but also decors, but very much also to do recording, because in a way, radio and television or media in general has so much evolved that nowadays the technology changes so quickly that a kind of archigram-esque truck which records and which is connected with the halls is not even our own invention. It was a question of the competition. So the truck is parked next to the big hall. He does the recording, the regie, and then after a few hours, the truck drives somewhere else because they have a kind of on location thing to do. And it returns, it goes into the garage, the second big box, you could say, for repair, for cleaning and so forth. And that's what it is. So it's very strange. Recording, broadcasting has something in common, weirdly enough, with a fire station all of a sudden. And at the same time, and you see it on the other side, these other two boxes, so to speak, or buildings are more office-like. One is the media building and the other one is kind of the administrative building, so to speak. They obviously carry the plate above, but they make a cluster of buildings with a foyer in the middle. And this foyer, of course, is part of the campus. So if you go to the top, these four boxes carry a space. They literally do that, meaning they cut through this figure, but also beams which connect each of these boxes carry the plate, which is one continuous, in a way, interior, where we looked, and I think it's in a certain way clearer when you saw the initial sketch and then the final sketch of the ear or the piano or the barba papa, depending on how you want to look at it, and your sympathy for the building. But essentially, it was an attempt to make a space which felt endless, and then you had to kind of cut it in some way. Do you cut it literally, radically, or you kind of smoothen the cut so that you never quite understand where it's cut? And so in a sense, this idea of endlessness is even emphasized. So that was a bit our take. Then it's just one big interior which sheds towards the north, which is the top of the plan here, and in a kind of band like system, which makes a certain organization in this kind of non-hierarchical space possible. So inside the boxes, as you can see below, you had already studios. I mean, studios immediately accessible by trucks. Above, quite the same. Some studios stick through, others are new on that height. Smaller studios, bigger studios. I think in this initial design, you see many smaller studios also in the champ. Something that I can come back to that later, which was increasingly included also in these emergences in these boxes over time. So this is means two, I mean, of course, very pretentious references, but they were there in the very beginning. That's why I mentioned them on the panel. So we thought, is it possible to combine somehow as an urban idea the non-stop with say, the Campo Marzio thought of many buildings clashing and creating some tension between them and making a suggestion, or I would say mise en scène, if you want, of urbanity in this extremely unurban space. Baldassari also there on that first panel, you probably saw it when I showed it quickly. Of course, there meaning you cut out a part of the field, and that field, of course, masks something you don't understand what happened. It creates that kind of tension. It organizes to a certain extent here the tableau or there the space. So these are the both section and facade drawing competition. You see that, of course, the moment you define a box, many things can happen in the box. The moment you define a kind of a field or an interior, I mean, the interior can, of course, house all kinds of furniture. And I would like to emphasize this because I believe it was important then, but it became even much more important over time. It's also, of course, you could argue the main link between the two projects I want to. Although in conception, in thought, in what they are about, in the end, it's a search for, I would say, special types. In this case, the continuous, I mean, so almost industrial hall-like shed-like space with continuous light, equal light conditions, and in this particular case, a view to the lake and the mountains, and the box which can house many things, and which, promises endless flexibility as long as the box somehow remains the box, and it keeps carrying the building, of course. So here is a set of perspectives. I mean, at the time, and I think it was also the only time, because of course it was a competition that took so long, we worked literally together with Bas Prinsen on the perspectives. I mean, in many other occasions, of course, we make perspectives. Bas takes pictures much later in the process. We talk a lot with each other, but here we wanted to try. I mean, we realized that going from these very sketchy panels in the very beginning, in the end, we had to beat Diller Scofidio, Placaton Vassal, Bernard Tschumi, and a lot. And so we knew that if we don't make something which always looked real, had a certain sense of hyper-reality, it would not work. But we were afraid to, I would say, give up our identity. So we started working with these double perspectives, as I said, together with Bas, where in the way the weather in both sides of the view is never the same. And in a way, if you would glue them together, the perspective wouldn't work. So we thought that was an interesting way in kind of keeping a certain sense of, I would say, conflict or counterculture in an otherwise extremely smooth representation, or as you can see here, light or night or day, and so forth, or inside and outside. So this was the set as we presented it, and I would say, although we felt in the first pitch we had a chance, in the second pitch we thought we were lost in space and they would never take us, and then somehow in the third pitch, here you see the engineering plan of these beams, and the final, the third pitch presentation, and here you see the small model where it, the building fits in the kind of wide model as they typically give you in provincial places like Lausanne, and where you can kind of fit in beautifully your model for comparison. And then here, the big box as an interior and the field as another interior inside this, in a way, enormous model we made to try to win the competition. So the beautiful thing, of course, was that we won the competition, and that's then, well, 5.5 years ago now, I think. And then developed. Now, while that process developed, we all of a sudden we move fast forward in time, so about 80 numbers further or something, to 252. And in number 252 was, I would say, an extremely ambitious attempt of ourselves, together with Kirsten Gantenbein, to try to win the new, museum competition in Brussels. I mean, very important competition for us, for Brussels. Why? Of course, it was, I mean, not unlike what Urtzi was explaining with Guggenheim, but on a smaller scale. There was, after I think long negotiations, interest by the Pompidou to invest in Brussels, or at least the other way around a little bit. People convinced Pompidou that if they would pay them a lot of money, they would be ready to come and kind of lend their label to yet another cultural satellite. Of course, with that providing somehow the certainty that good art, so to speak, was to be seen also in Brussels for people who don't want to take the train to Paris. In many ways, this very big former French garage building, I mean, the Citroën garage, so I mean, in that sense, perhaps well chosen for a Pompidou, had to be transformed. It's been empty and semi-derelict for quite a while on the canal area, which is what you see here. These are, in a way, fragments of the competition panels you just saw. So where are we? We're Brussels. You have to imagine that your right side is the north of Brussels. I apologize for that. And the left side is the south of Brussels. The canal goes from south to north, from north to south. Next to this canal, where you see the white cutout, so to speak, in this perspective, is indeed the site for the competition, the Citroën garage. Next to it is a bit of a park-like neighborhood, which in fact doesn't look so beautifully green. If you would go there today, it's kind of a modernist scheme with housing slabs and semi-fenced park. And then on the other side, what is here extremely green, we are already in the era of greenwashing, of course, presented is the development of the canal area, where currently there's like successively just up from say Canal or Pompidou or Citroën Garage, a KBC building next to another one, and then this bigger complex, which is Tour and Taxis. So very big fragments in the north of the city, which are now gradually being transformed in more and more housing and other functions. Formerly, somehow, so the Citroën Garage used to look like this. It's in a way, it was a very impressive building back then. It was a really spectacular expression, and I think it was the first Citroën building or building built by Citroën outside France. So it was very representative for the idea of what Citroën wanted to be and how it wanted to connect a certain idea of modernism to their own car kind of culture. And in a way, very beautiful high space. Which is, if you think away the cars, roughly a little bit like that. I mean, with interesting luminosity, plenty of problems, and to a certain extent not so brilliantly built, to the extent that our engineer, the engineer in the team, Brolin Broman class, he was convinced that in the future life of this structure, if you wouldn't reinforce it, it would never really survive. But despite that, of course, the desire of the competition was clear. I mean, to deal with the building and to destroy a minimum. So here you see the plan of the building. It's a complex one. It's roughly this hall, as you saw the picture of on the right of the drawing. It has this very strange boat-like building, which makes for the old showroom of Citroën. And then it has, like in the top left corner, it has a very different building, which has nothing to do, not even with the competition. It's the Kai Theater. It's a kind of theater building, which is very successful in some sense. And was also looking perhaps, or is looking for new relationship with the future cultural kind of player, and also with the canal. And then on the lower side, just next to this, boat-like, lipstick-like, a building are a couple of buildings which simply are there. I mean, are historically part of the fabric and are not part of the competition and not even cultural. It's kind of housing, not unbeautiful housing buildings. So here you see the structure. Here you see the structure somehow, say, simplified, and to a certain extent, here you see also immediately our proposal to intervention. So we were interested in trying to understand how a building like this, which is essentially a big hall, which you cannot really climatize. I mean, for that, if you would want to give it a proper, I would say, climate quality, I mean, fitting the standards as they had described in the competition, say the Pompidou standards for kind of a masterpiece art or whatever you would call it, that would be downright impossible, because I mean, you would have to destroy the whole building by making an entire building in the building, or redoing the detailing of the glass in such a way that it would be exactly the same glass and so forth. Apart from the fact that it would be too expensive given the budget for the transformation of the building. And so we barely proposed to, in a way, and if you go back one more time, to transform fundamentally. You see on the lower part next to the building which we had to keep, which is not part of it, make a new building, which is a storage building, and to add a very big new building, almost like to literally pinch it through the existing halls as a Fremdkörper, as a visitor, you could say, to these otherwise beautiful halls. Because we thought it was more interesting to radically intervene and to, by doing that, to fulfill all their requirements in one gesture. I mean, the storage, the building with the round circle on, the storage building, plus library, plus architecture, archives in some sense. And on the other hand, the rectangle, as you see, which somehow, I would say, negotiates with the structure, which becomes, in a way, the main, I mean, climatized exhibition space, leaving the rest as space, urban space, public space, exhibition space, in some sense, proper. So the kind of a lipstick on the left, or the kind of boat-like figure, became again, like originally it was, kind of a showroom. So here you see, to a certain extent, the two very evident ideas, of course. On the one hand, the idea of the Crystal Palace as a space where, in a way, even trees can grow, and everything can be exposed, and the line between urban space, collective space, covered square, and exhibition space is extremely fluid, extremely unclear. And on the other hand, of course, I mean, Cordoba mosque after the intervention by the Spanish, where all of a sudden, of course, the church and its interior, at least if you look at it from a kind of a cultural historical perspective, I mean, I think you can have plenty of problems with rather violent gesture of one religion towards the other, but at the same time, by intervening on one spot, I think everybody who has been at Cordoba can attest that the structure, the architecture, and the particularity, the speciality of the rest of the mosque becomes even the more apparent. So, in a sense, in our box for our box we had the same ambition. So here you see that again, halls which work, of course, in the winter and summer, but in simple ways. I mean, not fully climatized, but kind of semi. And then, in a way, two conditioned boxes: the exhibition one and the archive one. So this was the proposal as we had it. So you could say, on the one hand, a perspective which shows that we changed nothing and we changed everything. As close as we were, I would guess, to finally win the competition, I think ultimately the very fact that it was such an aggressive, visually aggressive gesture. So these two figures, at least by some people, it was considered that way, was also considered its biggest risk. I mean, strategically, of course, has all the kind of exhibition spaces allowing you to say, Pompidou, you can bring your Brancusis. But at the same time, having this enormous hall below, which is unclear whether the billikens, which are here at show, or the tables and the chairs, or the lamps, or the trees, are either exposition or space or market, and so forth. So here you see an AXO made by Smets, showing rather the strategy of the urban space, right? I mean, so his intervention also was steps to water. You see here on the left, the conditioned hall, the cylinder-like archive building on its base, which is also in a way was the Architecture Institute. Of course, the incorporation of the theater, I mean, without changing it, but saying, look, it is part of this set of fragments. Plus, of course, the very old kind of a display hall, again, as a, I mean, of course, call it like the turbine hall in some sense. You can criticize it, but at the same time, simply saying the space is a space, and then let's see what you can do with that as a display space. So the model with the structure, I mean, as it was, we simply proposed to paint it, as you can see. The model seen from the canal, and then this display case building. Here you see these plans. So essentially on the ground floor, as I was saying, we kept the whole structure. You have the big new archive building, which is the one with the cylinder on the lower part of the plan, the display building on the very left side of the plan, the existing theater, and the big box, which intervenes and reorganizes. I think here. So here you see the second floor plan, sorry, where, I mean, the space was not as clean as you might have imagined based on the few pictures I showed you. It had plenty of second level floors. We decided to take down most of them, but here and there keep a few because the space was so high that we could also have a couple of children ateliers and different kind of boxes in boxes on the second level using that structure. You see that here with the kind of passerelle, which even connects something like a balcony into this display building on the very left, and which connected the Architecture Institute or the archive building with the rest of the infrastructure bordering both the theater and the hall. So this, in a way, was the perspective. Yeah, whereas we worked together also with Richard Vendet, the artist. I mean, the art or Mulliken, we had to show, of course, that was kind of somehow the Pompidou range. The words canal and the strange typography is Joris Kritis. And the kind of weirdo cuts, the kind of, yeah, what is it called? Kind of almost like guirlande of some kind. They are Richard Vendet. So both the triangles as the kind of half circles were his intervention in the building, almost to decorate it. So here you see the display hall. You see yeah, the building of the archive with the entrance from the back, which is also somehow a logistical entrance. You see that, and the two volumes organizing the space. You see a cut through the big architecture archive with the architectural reading room and the logistics. For the rest, you see this kind of a part of the hall which connects with this display building. The parking garage they also wanted, which we put under the only part of the building which we built anew, of course. I would say pragmatically so. The reading room of the architecture department, the archive building, and the top, which has, I would argue, slightly cynically, the obligatory bar which they specifically wanted. But okay, which he thought was an interesting kind of alibi to introduce this strange guirlande-like figure. See it at night. And then we see the other, in a way, big intervention. So the big box, we see there on the left, which interacts with the rest of the space of the hall itself painted and reinforced with these, what they called in the jury, these socks. They were very concerned. They thought that we changed the whole structure, but in a way the engineer just proposed to weld kind of a steel plates around all sides of these steel structures in order to stiffen them, to make them stronger, which turned out later to be fundamental, but the jury didn't believe, but okay. So it goes. And then here you see this big box with, in a sense, we discussed a lot with Richard Venlet. In the end, an artist was very interested in curating. Like what kind of space do you need to make? I mean, what is a museum nowadays? And ultimately, we ended up with this extremely, you could argue, banal box, a set of plates with various heights. Only twice interrupted with these triangular windows. You can see them here on the left and on the right, these openings. And for the rest, even more or less windowless, because I mean, the top we gave a top light, but working with Chris Gantelmein also, who have of course been doing quite a lot of museums, even they got at that time quite skeptical about, you know, the difference between the initial desire for natural light and the reality of using it in that type of exhibition spaces. So here you see, I mean, just a set of possible variations on squares and rectangles and of, in a way, ideas on how this otherwise extremely simple space, almost kind of a post-fact industrial reenactment of the building, the lower building doesn't even fully is, you know, it's the same rhythm, same structure, same columns. In this time, all concrete as opposed to all steel. I mean, that's basically the thought. See here and here back on the ground floor in direct relationship with the hall. So here the hall again with the Mulliken and the outside, which of course, I mean, again, and the outside here, if it wanted to come. Where am I? Oh wait, sorry. The outside in the dark, okay, fine, which shows very much the intervention of Richard Vendet. The building ended up being in our garage or in our cellar or wherever it is, unsuccessful. At least I think there was a lot of support for it. I think I'm not exaggerating when I say that we almost managed. But then you don't, which is also not a drama, but I'm also happy for that reason perhaps to show it here. And of course, in retrospect, and it being in a sense between the beginning and the second step of RTS building, you realize that in many respects, of course, this figure of the box and the field, whether entirely built like here or not at all, like here, it has much in common. And so it ultimately, of course, it is an argument about what you fix and what you let go, what you keep loose in architectural definition, and to what extent that allows you to make, you could say, an urban constellation without fundamentally answering precisely to programmatic needs. So here we go back, and this is, I mean, say, it's not exactly chronological. It might be that this is made just before or just after the material I just showed you. But in any case, in the last 2 years now of the development of RTS, I mean, so since winning the competition, we went on for another 5.5 years. We made plenty of variants, which in an odd way always somehow were the same. So here you see that this is a variant, this is a model which is not the exact variant which we now started to build, but it's close. And it shows you to a certain extent, I mean, this is a silly little movie which was made to show also to the clients. It was made by a model, and then I hope that gradually, it's not even a movie, I have to click myself. It shows all the elements of architecture, you can say, which we designed in order to endlessly reorganize their own kind of that next, where is it? Sorry guys. For some reason these pictures go very, very slow. Okay, here I see them like this. So what you see are these 4 boxes. These boxes are still very much there. The facade of these boxes have had very many versions, but the current version, as we're building it now, is similar to this. You will see the next one. Don't really know when pressing my button has an effect and when not. I apologize for that. But in any case, so these boxes make this foyer. What you perhaps see on this, if you could compare it with the very early version of it, is that now the left emergence, or the next box, is completely cut loose from the foyer. But are you still seeing my screen? Yes.
Yeah.
But it's strange because, I mean, wait a second. For me, my screen doesn't move anymore. So I'm trying. We're almost there. Wait, I try something, guys. I have many problems with this. 1 second. Here it is. But it's extremely slow in how it reacts to my arrow now. I don't know why that is. Guys.
Maybe we can stop screening and do it again.
Yeah, well, but at this moment it doesn't even move on my computer, and even I tried with my arrow to do something, nothing happens. 1 second. Even if I put escape to escape full screen, nothing happens. So I have a feeling there's a little issue here.
Not to lose momentum, but why don't we just take a 2-minute break and then we. You got it? Okay.
Well, I mean, at least he kind of seemed to be doing more normal again. It's a strange problem with this file. Okay, it's also not so important. Huh? From time to time, I see something changing, which is good. Okay. A silent moment in the Zoom is also not a bad thing. Well, you know what this model, if ever it appears fully like to show, I guess, or at least what I find interesting about this model, despite anything, is that it shows to a certain extent the complexity of such a building, and in a way that a couple of architectural ideas, perhaps as crazy as they are, manage to yeah, you see it here. I go back. This managed to contain that complexity. So in 5 years, the building had been cancelled about 3 times, I think, and that had been revived. It has changed the program tremendously because radio and television is something which, of course, was already very different 5 years ago from 10 years ago. There was a dominance of television, dominance of radio, new media. The way things are produced is so quickly changing that to a certain extent, and perhaps I would say interestingly so, you have to, and these are perspectives of, I think, about a year and a half ago. So I see them here, the outside perspective, Fayil perspective, and then the perspective of the working place, which, by the way, is very, very close to what now are the final renders. Because why I say final renders, because here I show very quickly the final plans. So these are the plans as we are currently. Started already the works, but then it goes in parts. What you hope you can see is that, of course, on the one hand, the building is the building as it was. At the same time, the building is, of course, being totally redesigned, which is also interesting. Now, here you see the plans, and I think then after that, I have one more perspective to show, which is hardly even called perspective. It's a render actually, which we are supposed to present to the client in a week. Yeah, that's it. So this is the building. This is the building. It's so real that you think it's actually built, because that was that's a render made by a French render firm, specifically on demand of the client to see all the design decisions. I'm talking about every single profile, every single window, everything of the building as it's now under construction. But of course, mind you, that construction will take another 4.5 years. Voilà. That's it.
Thank you, Kirsten. I'd like to maybe open up the conversation to the students for the moment to ask if there are some, let's say, well, specific questions to Kersten about the work that he presented. Now the two, let's say, projects, well, multiple projects. But I give the floor over to you guys. And then, yeah, let's, we maybe do 10 minutes of questions, something like this. And then we open the floor to a kind of conversation where maybe we can have, where we'll have both Urtzi and Kersten together to reflect on the contemporary status of building competitions. The, yeah. Felipe, you have...
Yeah. So I was wondering, because I read about this test period that happened in the KANAL competition, and where all the architects with a proposal would go into this test period. So for me, it's very curious to hear about this, and maybe what are the sorts of things that you are observing in this stage. And how do you think they go on as you start developing the design?
Sorry, you mentioned the test period. What do you mean with the test period?
Yeah, I read in the document they say that all architects they did like a sort of test period in the KANAL proposal for everybody to like. If the building was culturally accepted and appropriated by the citizens.
Oh, like that. Yeah, I don't know much about that. Yeah, I mean, no, really, quite frankly, I don't know much about that. I heard that, but the truth was they had already decided. But it's true that then they displayed the works. I mean, different models, panels, I think also. And then, of course, they wanted to figure out, and they asked, I think, all the people visiting the show, which was actually in that very building, to leave their opinion. So I think that was the test you refer to. But as far as I remember, it had no impact or no influence on the jury decision, quite frankly. mean, the context of this competition is complicated. Well, it's not very complicated, but it's of course very much about regional politics. I mean, it's very complex to summarize the extremely insane Belgian kind of, or I would say, government system in 2 sentences. But you could simply say that Brussels is an entity on its own, which has relatively little money. Because most, I mean, say, national funds or money from the government is regionalized. So, I mean, culture is a Flemish or a Walloon or French-speaking kind of has that mandate. So that means that if Brussels wants to do something, they always have to be very inventive. They have to do a trick. That's also why there was, and there still is, I think, there was somehow lots of skepticism about this whole idea of Pompidou coming to Brussels, because in a way there's plenty of collections in Belgium. So why do you need
To import.
It was, of course, to a certain extent, a trick to avoid, I mean, a whole complex discussion with different communities on which art it had to be and where it had to come from and who was going to pay for this. So in order to do that, a move which, by the way, was also seen as a strange maneuver, if you know that there's already a big art place in the Beaux-Arts, and there's also an important contemporary art place in the Wheels in Brussels. So perhaps the location was well chosen. There's already a building. And then many people considered that, and that's also how I would read a little bit what has finally won, that was important to make something of a project where the gesture of doing the project is more important than the actual way the project looks like. I mean, the big disadvantage of art design, I always read, is that if you promise kind of this kind of figures as a new silhouette, if finally you don't manage to build them, you failed. If you promise something which does not look like anything, then it always succeeds, because that's even the situation today. Many people ask me, and Canal, is it happening? Is it already there? And I'm always thinking, oh, maybe it is, because it looks, I mean, I know the winning competition project, it looks kind of the same as the building now. So in a sense, so I think this played a much bigger role than anything else. And then, of course, there's this delicate story that the Citroën building is in general quite beloved. Now, people in Brussels tend to love their kind of 30s kind of glamour to a certain extent. So the less you do, the better it is. No, I mean, I read a bit like that. But of course, it was funny to see Urtzi's project, because I know Urtzi talked to me about his Helsinki, but never quite saw it. I didn't know it was so much about climate and stuff. I mean, and kind of, the way you say maintain a certain climate for buildings and also to show art. I think ultimately the Brussels competition was very much about that too. But I believe I would argue with the lie a little bit, that people think that you can easily promise, the building like that, let's keep it, it's good, and we solve the climate, which I don't believe is true. And that was, I would say, quite a big debate. So our intervention, you concentrate the climatized and you leave the rest for what it is. I still think is, how to say, it's not just about strategy, it's about respect towards the building. I mean, I think today people have this obsession with keeping things, but they don't realize that if you want to keep, you also have to keep the trouble of the buildings, which is okay. I don't know. I know I walked away from the question about.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, I was also wondering about the refurbishment in today's atmospheres. But yeah.
But maybe related to that, about could you maybe talk, if you remember, I mean, it's been some time, but what were the restrictions imposed because on the heritage building and all these things? Because in a way, and I don't mean this cynically, but in a way, I was sort of very surprised. There's a certain evenness to actually all the competition entries. I mean, it was a very competitive competition. The outcome many of the same spatial strategies were a little bit used. You know, there was a sameness across the board. So was that really due to the given brief?
Well, yeah, well, the sameness was there in as much that everybody kept the building because you had to. I mean, you could build on top of the building. That's what they even suggested themselves. There had been made a study, and I think OMA embraced that study somehow. And you could so-called keep the building as it is, and you build a box on top of the roofs or something like that. That's what they literally kind of suggested at a certain point. And that you build where we had built the archives, a new building that was kind of evident because it was the only place where you could build a new building. And some others, most others, was that we intersected our building in a way rather aggressively with the existing structure. I think in most cases the decision was rather to build under the roof or above the roof to a certain extent. Yeah, I don't know, that's how I remember the entries, but it's even true that I didn't look again, and I was so angry when it didn't win that I actually didn't properly look.
Is there another question, guys?
Yes, I wanted to ask you, so going back to the Canal competition, so many contemporary competitions deal with urban renovation and improvement of, let's say, deteriorated industrial areas of big cities like the Brussels one. And yeah, they try to transform these industrial buildings to art institute, like also like this competition of Maison General in Paris. So what does this trend say about the relation between science and art today? Should all like abandoned warehouses or industrial buildings be replaced with museums or galleries?
But quite frankly, I think this argument is a lot about rhetorics. And I think it's a bit of in my opinion, these rhetorics don't match reality. That was, by the way, also partly our provocation. We said, look, you want so-called, they have then these standards, something class museum such and such, so it has to fulfill that. We said, well, then you have to build a new standard. I mean, in a sense that even, and that building was much better insulated. I mean, the famous example of the last, say, 15, 20 years, the Lacaton Vassal, Palais Tokyo, apart from the fact that as much as I adore their practice, and as much as I think that the building is emblematic, I don't per se think it's a great museum, but fair enough. It's a museum for a kind of art, which I think at Palais Tokyo they understood. I mean, they do that type of art, which is not, it's fine. But of course, you will not be able to hold a Brancusi show, meaning 90% of the collection of what the Pompidou has. I mean, a very expensive Paul Klee painting or something, you will not put there. It's just not possible because climatically you cannot control. It's absolutely not possible. It's already not possible to show in the Beaux-Arts building in the Brussels Center, which is a quite good Horta building, relatively well maintained and in a way with proper echo, most of these type of works, because the requirements are so high, it's just not possible. Now you can ask yourself, is it not nonsense that work which has in an atelier of, say, Brancusi now has to be caressed, and put in these surreal conditions? I think that's an interesting debate. But if you say, I'll change all my warehouses into that type of museums, yeah, you can, of course, win a competition by pitching this. But the reality is that I think if you then try to do it, it doesn't work. I mean, it's like what I was mentioning in the competition. Already the very fact that we got calculated the structure and we said you have to reinforce it with the socks, they accused us of pretending that the building did not hold. And we said it doesn't. I mean, you can pretend, but it doesn't hold. I mean, you need, not only can you not these people in there, I mean, not possible. I mean, and they were upset. And later we heard, okay, there were various reasons for that. They said, look, you guys, you wanted to transform the building too much, even the socks. We don't understand. But I mean, it was just pragmatics. So in that sense, to answer your question, there's plenty of rhetorics around nowadays, from green buildings to reuse to this and that. And of course, as an architect, I think you have to also partly understand, or you have to understand that at least partly you are playing a role in that. And I also don't think it's per se wrong. I mean, in the diploma studio this semester in Visual, I did a studio called The Cultural Imaginary of Energy. where I think the exact topic was this, that is that partly as an architect, you're responsible to represent this imaginary, to kind of say, look, it's perhaps not true, but the tradition of lying in architecture or doing mise en scène and presenting an idea rather than actually embracing it because it works, I think that's also partly our job. So there's no problem with that. That of course today you are, I would say, confronted in competitions very often with situations where people choose projects because they seem to answer to all these desires, finally not to be able to execute them because they simply don't work. I think that's cynical. Yeah. Right.
Thanks. Yeah.
I have just two observations very quickly, so feel free to react to any of those. First one is, I think there's a very well-defined working set in both competitions that you show, but also in other competitions that your office has developed. There's a very strong plan, a very strong section, a very strong elevation, but there's also simultaneously a production of a very well-defined model, and also the production of collages. And there's a moment in the process of working in the competition in which these three outputs take their own path. Sometimes the people working in the drawings just take their own way, and the model needs to begin because it has to take its own sort of chronology and its own moment. And simultaneously you got the team working on the images and sort of working precisely on the output of their message that each of these working sets wants to deliver. So I was wondering, what is the precise moment in which these kind of depart in their own way, and perhaps at the end they come together to summarize the ideas. And the other observation is there is this kind of,
look, yeah, sorry.
No, it's just that there's this idea of inviting people to the team, not only engineers that many of the competitions require, but there's also the idea of inviting artists, your collaboration with Vas Prinsen. So I was wondering what is your opinion on the added value that these collaborations bring to the proposals?
If I take your comment seriously, there's like about 300 questions, of course. But I mean, if I try to pick here and there some of the topics you bring up, I think first of all, I think what's important in our office is that it's an office of two people, and now it's true that nowadays we are even three partners. But let's say the office has always been run by David and myself, so it's an office where everything, all of the output is the result of a dialogue, in the sense that never a project is a project because I want it to be like that, or David for that matter. And it's also an office where I think the things themselves, whether it's the model, the perspective, the plan, well, the whole entry, if you want, is, I would say, sanctioned by both, but not with explanations. You know what I mean? Like, it's not that the whole thing is there and then it's good because of that. No, I mean, just at a certain point we think it's good. I mean, I don't know whether David thinks it's good for the same reason as me, but we seem to think it's good. So that's good news, which I like very much, because I very much believe that architecture, it's not the only place, but architecture certainly is still a place where ambiguity is a quality. That is that what you make, it represents many things. It doesn't need to be clear what it represents. It is a place where you can say, well, I used to say long in the past, claim without consequence to a certain extent. It's a place where you can doubt, where you can claim and counterclaim, where many things are somehow unresolved in the form as it is presented. In that sense, I've been always very much in opposition to the idea that architecture or the project in architecture is supposed to represent one single idea. It never did in our practice, and in a way, all the practices, or all the oeuvres, if you want, I appreciate. Whereas perhaps formally they are somehow coherent. So I think that's very, very important. Now, if you embrace that as a thought, it's easy to collaborate because, you know, if somebody else enters and you appreciate the work of that person, and of course you do not collaborate with whoever, I mean, because I think we have big trouble very often to collaborate with colleagues, so to speak. I mean, other architects, it seldomly works out well. Sometimes it does. But it's kind of easy to work together with an artist like Richard Van Lett or Bas Prinsen, because, well, first of all, we've been sharing in the past certain, I would say, formal interests. And secondly, I think they can do things we cannot do. For example, if you do a project with, I mean, like say, these windows, as you saw them in the canal, to mention now one specific example, this kind of guirlande-like windows, I wouldn't be able to design it. I wouldn't have a clue how they look like. And if I would draw them, I would think I'm kind of a kind of idiot formalist architect. So, you know, I'm happy that we're there together with Richard Bennett, and that, you know, at a certain point he says, I think it needs these kind of things. And you say, interesting. And then, you know, somebody cuts this out in the model, and then it's made in the collage, and you're like, that's interesting. And then, you know, maybe why Richard said so is maybe different from why I like it. It's possible, but it works. And I think it's that kind of bandwidth you have to allow yourself. And it's not different with Bas and so forth, with other people we work with. But it's also true that in the end, I do not think, or at least that's not how I see it, I wouldn't see the building as our building with the Richard Van Lett guirlande. No, I think the whole project is shared. I mean, perhaps, I didn't show it today, but a better example of that is the crematorium, which we won 5 or 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, I don't remember. Long time ago, 7 years ago probably. Anyways, it's almost finished now. Construction is about to end. Well, I think it will only open in April, but now the building is there essentially. It's a few months away from being totally completed. And that we did with Richard Vennet already in the competition. I think in the competition, if I would have a long talk, I would be able to tell you, this was part of the conversation, that was part of the conversation, that not. But today, I mean, we went to the site together, David, Richard, and myself last week. We judged it all together, you know. It's okay. I mean, it's he's there.
But maybe if I can interject in this before we
everywhere too
into the I guess, well, let's say types of collaborations that are based on shared ideas or shared interests or mutual interest or complementary ideas, right? Which is what you're alluding to. But then going back to this reality of the competition and the need to basically build consortiums, for lack of a better word, or coalitions, you know, which is maybe, you know, because of what is it called, reputation and references, you know, in a kind of package. So
these are all fake in a way. These are all fake. That's the problem of contemporary competitions. These are totally fake. I mean, no, I mean, that's the drama of today. I don't know, maybe I idealize it. You guys have been studying older competitions, never did. I do have the vague feeling that it used to be simple, that you just say, you know, you made your proposal, your sketch, and that was it, which probably also allowed these people to win the Paris Opera instead of Richard Meyer, because nobody could even see the difference, you know. But today, of course, with this, I mean, maybe with the distinction of the Guggenheim, but then I saw that, I don't know how many thousand, 16,000, 100,000, I don't know, entries there were. And then I think Urtzi had to be lucky that at least Juan Herreros was in the selection committee. Nevertheless, I mean, fair enough. You know, I think, I mean, also we, by the way, the guy in RTS, the guy who was on the picture, Luc Cartelli, that is, he was fundamental in our choosing for that. I mean, he was my dean in EPFL school. So, you know, if he would have made a bad project, he would have not been doing that. But we made the project which helped him to choose us, so to speak. And I believe very much in that. So that's all fine. I think that's all absolutely fine. And by the way, we can come back to that in a minute. I think the way because he was the head of the competition in the RTS, the way he organized that, I thought was an example for all competitions, I believe. We can come back to that. But to answer first your team issue, these teams are bullshit, because these teams, it's like you know, the only engine in a competition is the architect, really, and all the others are there to pretend that we can do all the other things. But the truth is, you only need these people afterwards. So I mean, so you have these gigantic teams with all these people, which you all have to pay, by the way, very often. They're always taken. They're, you know, I mean, it's surreal kind of a story with kind of building the quickest after a competition is opened a team. Then to have, with a few exceptions, of course, you can have a climate engineer you really like to work with, and you work with, and it works. And I mean, why not a structural engineer? But so often.
Yeah, clear. The maybe
An
can
advisor in green energy, and they want an advisor, you know, and in social correctness, and you name it. I mean, it's totally surreal. And I do not think it helps the team. And our experience is that in most cases, yeah, you design with a much smaller team, and maybe with some, like the artist, or with some, like the particular, I don't know, climatic advisor. Why not? Because, you know, you work always with that person. Yeah, that's true. That's
the,
absolutely.
maybe
But going to sorry.
yeah.
I mean, no, I wanted to mention this because I think about it now. The RTS competition, I thought, was quite remarkable on how the candidatures were, or how the first phase was organized. So basically, the question was to send 1A4, I've been in A3, I don't remember. I should have shown that one actually, in which you had to show a figure of a plan or a drawing, a scheme, so to speak, an idea of a perspective, but just an idea, and under the line, 2 projects of the office. So it wasn't anonymous. Two projects of the office which you filed, built or unbuilt, could explain why, you know, you could be a candidate. Of course, it helped us because the person of the head of the jury brought us in the last 8. I agree with that. But it made it possible to choose a couple of younger, with a couple of course, very fixed people. And it forced people like Diller Scofidio or Chumi or whatever to actually do a pitch and not simply say I'm, you know, Diller Scofidio. And it allowed people, I mean, Bauku had almost been in, I remember, yeah, to shoot at it and see where we could get, you know. And he did not have the feeling it was totally anonymous because, I mean, I understand, I mean, total anonymous. I mean, we did the career competition together with Dogma years ago and we were lucky. I mean, it was bizarre. But even then, I've always felt that the fact that Winnie Maas was in the jury was a reason. You understand? I mean, these things are never so objective as they pretend.
Mm.
The
Yeah, go.
No, go ahead, please.
No, of course, Kirsten experience with an office as big and having to get into so many competitions, probably broader than ours. I have a slightly different experience. We only do competitions. All the commissions are coming from competitions, and they've been usually with teams. We've been able to more or less escape the model that I agree with Kirsten is terrible of having to build insane teams. And I think, again, our experience in Australia, where, you know, Malcolm Regan and offices like that are in charge, and they know exactly that you need to kind of partner with a corporate office, you know, it has to be a corporate or local office, an international auto sheet base, and unless you show up in the submission with that team on clearly stated, you don't even you're not even considered. Like, and we were told like this several times. But I think there's still, and again, it's probably because the office is smaller, there's still kind of enough competitions around the world that are kind of operating in weird ways, right? Like right now, 2 years ago, 2018, we won a competition for a library in Milan that we're actually developing right now. And it was a competition put together by the Association of Architects of Milan through a kind of an open call and a kind of a complicated system, of course, because building in Italy is always an amazing adventure. But it's happening. The Velodrome in Medellin, kind of similar situation. We were able to get in there and get the first prize. Also, with a kind of partnership with Mazzanti, but having incredible autonomy. So I think there's still, for example, in Belgium, I think, Kirsten, you're part of this thing, like the it's called open call, the thing that the institute, yeah. does every year, every 2 years. I don't know. I haven't checked the last one. There are like still, and I think they're endangered species, but there are still things in which I think there's a set of values that have to be put on the table. It's first that is usually evaluated by peers, like in another discipline, right? Like you get architects involved to a certain extent in the decision making around is this a good project or bad project. They tend to be open and kind of to a certain extent. Obviously, many of them require CVs and things like that, but there's a level in which you cannot go beyond, and usually it relates with the scale of the building. When you get to a certain scale, you just have to prove that you're sort of like financial solidity, your kind of the level of resources you have. You can only get in if you have, the size that is completely impossible to maintain if you want to have an authorship-based practice. So you have to partner with a corporate, and then the whole drama starts, right? Go ahead.
That's also what you have been facing, no? Because of course, Urtzi, it's never black, it's never white. I would agree with that. But I mean, even your Medellin competition, I mean, let's face it, I mean, your local partner is semi-monster, I mean, and so without that semi-monster, no way you enter that whole game, and you know it very well. Maybe Milan is different, and that's great. I mean, no, honestly, and I've seen that, and you showed it to me, and I think that's fantastic. And I'm not negative in the purest sense. I mean, no, I'm not negative. I'm just realistic. I mean, in the sense that, I mean, also us. I mean, ultimately, despite the fact that our office is obviously of a certain scale, these competitions without partnering up with somebody even significantly bigger, in other words, a commercial firm. I mean,
what I was trying to get at is like, because of the luxury of the scale or the amount of salaries I have to pay at the end of the month, I have the luxury of choosing carefully what are the juries I want to talk to. Meaning not talk to literally, hi, I'm gonna win, but literally competitions become almost a way to wanting to have certain conversations through kind of proposals, right? And in a way, I choose a competition in which I think what I'm going to put in top of the table, someone that is in the jury will understand what I'm talking about, which is kind of basic, because if not, I agree. I mean, you just jump into things, and the kind of the ways of assessing it could become almost, completely blurry, or you find out you literally need to know someone in a jury that is not going to be selecting necessarily in a kind of a clean cut, but also assuming that you are there, therefore there has to be some quality in what you're proposing, right? So I think for me that has been historically an attempt to operate, right? Like, can we find things like that? It's true that sometimes it's getting a little bit complicated, right? And my experiences, and we tried one in Australia, I think in Adelaide together, is not fantastic. Actually, it's true that these competitions in which you get a lot of people and the jury is kind of not clear what it is, tend to have results that are basically dreadful. But still, I believe that there needs to be a support for competitions that it's maintain a different kind of this possibility, right? It's interesting. I think the Milan one is the one that I'm familiar with, and it's one of these occasions in which the Association of Architects of Milan decides to spend 5 years of investment in developing a software to produce a kind of a super transparent methodology to have competitions. And when it's developed, what they do is they give it for free to any public institution in Italy, with only the condition that all the competitions or any new building they're going to run has to go through this process, right? Which is an incredible kind of decision coming from within the profession, right? Like, it's like, wow. Or the kind of the model of what the open call that we mentioned in Kersten, that actually shifted radically the culture of architecture.
I do not think the open call is the example. I'm not so positive about the open call. I think it was very important, but it also shows that these projects, like many other projects, of course, they have an end date in some sense. And currently, I think the open call, and it can totally revive. I'm not saying it can't, but I think at this moment the open call is not in its best moment.
I know, and I agree with that. Europan was the same. There was a moment if Europan became a way in which many offices will
You know,
be
and
able to
Malcolm Redding, you mentioned it before, Malcolm Redding, indeed dominating increasingly the international, or at least the Anglo-Saxon competition world. I mean, we've been recently with, that was with 6A, with Emerson, we've been recently, well, shortlisted for a museum in New York, it was, I think. Yeah, then you see what comes out of that. Of course, you can be happy you made your pitch and you can, I don't know, publish it and say we were last 6 or we were 2nd or 3rd. Fair enough. But I mean, if you then see in what kind of silly circus you're part of.
Yeah, it's terrible.
I'm sorry, I'm not exactly so enthusiastic.
Yeah. That's, I completely agree with that. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think we became quite selective in these things. And I mean, and of course, as you say, Urtzi, I mean, it's probably in that sense a bit different. I mean, when we did the Korea competition or even the Mexico border crossing competition, there were competitions with a very unclear status. And we thought, well, let's see what it does. And then, you know, I think we were developing and investigating another vocabulary. And of course, two things happen. On the one hand, you have nothing to lose. On the other hand, your vocabulary is different from all the other people's vocabulary. So you're spotted. So that's what happens also. Of course, now we are fast forward 15 years or so, if not longer. So what happens is that half the world has copied our vocabulary. So we don't even make, you're not even distinctive anymore when you make something. So but that's also true. It's drama, but you just that I think now these kind of contexts are interesting to test something else. But that's not my role anymore. I mean, weirdly enough, we in our office, we are not there anymore to test something else. So, I mean, I'm totally supporting every single student I have to say, come on, stop looking at what we've been doing, what our generation has been doing, consider it boring. I mean, consider it something totally kind of accomplished to a certain extent. Look for something else. I mean, I'm looking for something else. And I say, I do these international open competitions within the mind, the idea that it's now about something else. Because the other obligatory grid and yet another kind of more or less two-dimensional collage, I can't see them anymore. You know what I mean? Like, it's like totally nonsensical. I mean, you know, this is not where I see architecture progressing. I mean, sorry. But that's also okay. That's fine. No, really. And there, I think these international open competitions have a role. It's a role which we used for. I mean, we played very much in that realm. Of course, now, I mean, yeah, it's almost 20 years ago, well, 15 years ago. But of course, if you then operate as an office, in the sense, let's build the building. I mean, that's a very different kind of attitude. And if you say let's do a competition Lausanne, or let's say unlucky again in York, I mean, then the game has to be played differently because otherwise.
Also those competitions come at the end of basically the heroic competitions that went through the 90s and late 80s. Some of them you look at are the ones that cement the idea of a kind of an architect that is able to operate any place in the world with no context and locality. And I think like the most interesting competitions right now are extremely local, whether because the governments that are pushing them are kind of protecting an idea of culture through the architecture that is being asked to be produced. But this idea that there is kind of massive global competitions in which architects got submitted is in a crisis. I think Australia, where I am based right now, is going through the last wave because everything arrives there slightly later. So now, you know, Michael Redding is getting kind of competitions of global museums in Australia all over the place that don't make any sense whatsoever. That's one was what's called the Powerhouse Museum kind of a year ago with a terrible set of global architects presenting terrible submissions. And you know the list already sounds like from the 90s. Stephen Hall, things like that. So I think one has to kind of look carefully at smaller competitions that are happening at kind of local scale, that only people with local knowledge of the context is able not even to submit proposals, but actually to engage with the kind of the network of questions and a kind of the peculiarities of the situation itself, right? Like, for example, I'm now in Barcelona, right? Barcelona is going through a boom of competitions, like incredible amount of competitions happening in Barcelona and areas around. kind of regional museums, housing blocks, little schools. Guillermo and Ana from Mayo can give you a list of how many they're doing right now, right? But there's no any chance that someone is not based in Barcelona will even get shortlisted to any of these things. It's not even that the question that you have to submit everything Catalan or something. Is that there's kind of this clear understanding through the local authorities or the people that are evaluating these things that there is a requirement of going back to local knowledge, probably a local identity. I mean, the success of H architects, H arquitectos in Barcelona becoming the official way of explaining what kind of architecture should be in this region of Europe is kind of a point, right? Like basically just jumping, taking over RCR, RCR. So I think that's the other case, right? That this is really difficult times right now, because if you want to operate globally, you have to engage with Malcolm Redding. That's the guy. Those are the guys that have the monopoly over, and a couple of other firms, of getting big. Or if you want to operate doing the all competitions, you have to be local, which is, and I think that's why the old model in Belgium was really interesting, because it was one of the first places in which that happened. And it's true that now it's not working so well, but the open call it's basically cemented that kind of a generation of local architects like yourself, no?
Yeah, sure. But look, I agree with what you say, Urtzi, in the sense that, I mean, knowing both Mayo and H architects or architects well, I think they are very much experiencing today, the last 5 years, whatever, 7 years maybe, what we have been living through in the last, or in the 10 or 15 years earlier. I think that's very true. No, I mean, and as you say, as much as you could say that in Flanders, if you do a kind of mix of the 3, 4, 5 protagonists of our scene, so to speak, you more or less get an idea of what is imagined as the answer of the architecture. I think the same is, as you just said, happening in Barcelona. No, I mean, it's fascinating to see that. The only thing is that I do not know. It's interesting to look at it as phenomena, and of course, I think you. I mean, well, look, it's too long a conversation. I deal with your own practice. You've always been countercurrent in that, which I find funny. But in general, these are things you could almost only analyze, because ultimately you either belong to the scene or you don't belong to the scene. It's it's almost impossible to enter it. I mean, when I was, yeah, but it's really true. I mean, look, I mean, I was for 6 years in Holland. I mean, well, we know that, Solomon knows it very well. And then at a certain point I left, I mean, for Brussels. I mean, it was kind of over Ghent to Brussels, whatever. And we were there, let's say, on the right moment, so to speak. So there was a possibility. And we were lucky, and plenty of other things. And of course, it's not just here, it's here and the world, right? It's not purely local. But now, looking back at Holland, in the last 15 years, we tried from time to time. There's no entrance door. There's absolutely no door. I mean, there's no way to do anything there. They look at us and like, oh, guys, how are you? I mean, it's like I come from Switzerland or something. They think they're an insane person. They would not include, even though now the Dutch economy is slightly, well, at least the possibilities to think architecture are changing again. And that's okay also, but you just see that, you see these islands in quite the same way as you say the land of the 90s. It's very present. Everybody knows of them. You would go to Basel to see 300 buildings of Herzog de Meuron. I mean, nobody else would build there, no, would they? I mean, and then there's them and another part of Switzerland. I don't know. You can write a lot about architecture. You can analyze a lot of these things, but ultimately, quite many of these activities are insanely local. I mean, and not simply, in terms of opportunities, but simply the people acting in it are local actors, quite frankly. Yeah, I mean,
and I think if you want to try to map the situation of architecture right now in Europe, I mean, one can identify types of competitions and type of cultures, right? Like you could go to Switzerland, and who is building there. You got, like the Bruder, Moto, all the things that are happening in France. Just check out. I think that will be a beautiful exercise to actually map these things. How many of these buildings come from local competitions, and I think many of them that and how did each of them, what they do is master also in a way because it's local. I agree. These things happen in conversations, in local knowledge. They master the possibility of winning competitions. They construct credibility. Yeah, what?
It could also be the other way around, basically, that a competition makes a scene. If you look at the Ordos example, for example, where you clearly see, although it was maybe not really a competition, but at least that a competition after the fact also gets a kind of myth and hence also makes a kind of scene afterwards.
Yeah, but that's very, I mean, you use it as an example. I wonder if there's another one.
I think, in Europe, for example, there's I will take this cultures of competitions, I will take it also as a kind of conscious projects. I don't know how conscious they are, but eventually after the fact, you can identify, like the shift between PAN in France to Europe in 89, when kind of a series of competitions that come out after the destructions of the halls as a kind of a model in which young offices will take into France projects of housing, and then it becomes a European policy. And that actually was a project to produce sort of European architecture. And it goes in parallel to the Erasmus program. Architects in Europe will have a chance to actually build anywhere else in Europe to a certain extent, right? Like you will kind of produce a scene of European architecture. That fade out. Right now, what you have is really specific local kind of architecture scenes, and they are fed by public money through public competitions, and they are all extremely idiosyncratic. And I have not enough knowledge of these things. I tried to enter a couple of times in a French competition, and of course they don't even call you back. I mean, it's amazing, right? Like I haven't tried. I tried a couple of times Switzerland, and after discussing with local partners, it's clear that you have to do at least 10 in order to start to get into kind of the local scene. But I know that some firms from Spain have been able to be starting building their schools. Italy all of a sudden has these chances. I think it's a completely different model, right? Like from the kind of the massive competitions, and it's extremely European. Well, South America has some of these models too. Depends also the situation of the economy. The Anglo-Saxon world is running a completely different way, and I think to be aware of that in the present is really important because it kind of is really dangerous to make generalization of competitions. And for example, the majority of the criticism against competitions that I was mentioning with the Guggenheim competition came out of Anglo-Saxon analysis of Anglo-Saxon competitions. Peggy Dimmer talks about competitions when he talks about competitions in the States. And there haven't been an interesting competition in the States for years, right? While she probably doesn't know much about what's happening in Europe, or some certain sense in.
Who was she? Sorry.
Peggy Dimmer. Peggy Dimmer. She's been working a lot on labor and architecture, and she has this architecture lobby that is pushing for a kind of a structural union.
You're so much part of this East Coast world.
I'm sorry, you're the one who's still teaching there. I haven't taught there for years.
I remain European. I mean, I never understand these topics. It's too complicated for me.
Come on.
Why does everything has to be about something else? Why is not the building about the building? Why does it have to be about labor? I mean, what nonsense.
No, I agree. I was trying to point out
that, but I mean, yeah.
But I think that what I'm trying to get at is like competitions are saying competitions that say in buildings. There are like so many types and so many different. So actually to try to understand the different things that are happening right now is like a tectonic map. You need to kind of look at the different, and now more than ever, the local conditions are extremely important because it's there when.
I mean, I don't know, of course, what finally were. I mean, I should have known. Perhaps maybe Solomon sent me a list or so. I don't know. Sorry, Solomon, if that was true. But I do not exactly know what competitions you've all looked at. I heard some echoes of things. I mean, I heard La Villette, for example, or was it also the Opera or something in France? I don't know.
The Paris Opera House.
The Paris Opera, yeah, of course.
We had the Chicago Tribune Tower.
Yeah, and Pompidou also? No.
And no, we didn't have Pompidou. We had the Canberra Parliament Building, and
that's a good one.
Urban Plan, an Australian one. What what else do we have? In Parc de la Villette and the Palace of the League of Nations.
About the Grand Bibliothèque in Paris, no?
No. We just, I mean, we concentrated on these kind of historical moments. Well, yeah, maybe on one thing.
Sorry,
that
Solomon, I didn't hear the last sentence.
No, I was just saying the Palace of the League of Nations.
Yeah.
Was the last one. But one thing that maybe in trying to compose this series, what was very interesting was it was very hard to find with these historical examples to find people to talk about them, or let's say a younger generation. But basically we really had to go to well, people that did the first set of research, you know, on the Paris Opera House competition, for example, or, you know, so a great cast of characters for sure. But what was very hard was there was no scholarship, no new scholarship about these kinds of examples which are in the contemporary imagination. So even something like the Chicago Tribune Tower competition, right, which had its sort of maybe revival in the Chicago Biennial a few years, there was still no, let's say, scholarship, new scholarship related to that, you know, that we could find. So that's why it was important to have the two of you involved in this to to relate it to the kind of contemporary moment. And my point being here that, well, so, I mean, I would like to actually, if one of the students has a kind of question related to this or an observation, I would love to hear it, because I think that there is this sort of nostalgia from the side of students or young professionals about competitions as the way to, let's say, start to gain a certain kind of professional experience. And that's, and I don't know if that's really the case anymore. You know, I mean, like there's, you know, people still do Europan, right? And then you think like, well, come on, that's like over investing so much time. And so that's a kind of reality that is going to take, you know, take something, but it's as you observed earlier, it's that's a dead dog, you know? So, I mean, what my point is I guess from the students, if one of you has some kind of reflection on that or a question related to this, because I think that's really important to see how you are the future of the practice, you know? So, you know, in 15 years time, you will be sitting here having gained a kind of portfolio of experience and lamenting what is the next, what is the next move, so to speak.
I think it's a great question. Do you do competitions?
Yeah.
Just to summarize.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's kind of a paradox, because the architect, it's constantly looking for commission work, but at the same time, we love to talk about lost competitions, right? Which frame a high percentage of an office that it's commonly participating in competitions, because they help to build up ideologies, to test, to pursue some thoughts that can then be rendered into much more constructed ideologies. So yes, in a sense, I would say that, of course, participating in competition can build a lot of confidence also. But perhaps it's a matter of attitude or on recognizing upfront if you indeed want to win the competition, or you are purposely participating to lose and just use it as an experimental tool.
Yeah, but I wonder about this, and then really it's an observation or it's a thought. I don't know. It's too fresh in my head to fully argue from a clear perspective. But I was wondering this. I mean, well, many thoughts. Well, first of all, I think even at least from Europe, say eras of competitions. Weirdly enough, I mean, if you think of the competitions, quite some of them you mentioned, and I think also which crosses immediately across my mind, say La Villette, maybe Tre Grand Bibliothèque, maybe Opera, and so forth. Well, frankly, they're all French. I mean, and they're all French. They're all done in a very specific time frame. No, but it's interesting. I'm not saying. I know you mentioned Canberra, true.
Yeah.
You know, these big, even Pompidou. I mean, they're a very specific time frame with a very specific country with a very specific organization. That's one thing I wanted to say, and not different from say other eras, other countries, other economies, and maybe closer to what Urtzi was commenting on earlier, that they're in a way local. It's true, of course, that we then had perhaps internationalist players, but I think it had more to do with the way France saw itself. Like what they thought they needed to be France. They needed international people to be France. That's the French are a bit crazy in that, but they often have not. I mean, which is interesting, as opposed to the Swiss who always think they need themselves to be Swiss. So you know what I mean? Quite different. No, really. Now, next to that, I had another thought or an observation. I wonder, and because I had the tendency to agree with the last comment, which is, of course, that it's not always so much about the competition won, but also about the competition lost, and part of the nostalgia is maybe related to that. But then I was asking myself, is this not very specific for a very specific generation, if not even a specific actor? The first person which comes to mind, sorry, you know, cliche, but nevertheless, I think very much the first person who comes to mind is Koolhaas, who had become the king of the lost competition. And, you know, I think it's much harder already to define in Gary's work, you know, even Chumi's work, or even Venturi's work, Rossi's work. Their oeuvre is not defined by lost competitions. Their oeuvre is defined by buildings, even if they're not builders. But Koolhaas is this one bizarre figure, and there perhaps are a few more, but not many, whose oeuvre for some strange way is defined by the lost competition. I was almost there to think, and I'm sure he didn't, he would have loved to, of course, that he almost single-handedly invented the idea of the lost competition as the ultimate oeuvre achievement. No, but it's interesting. I was thinking, like, where does it come from? Because there's not so many, really. I mean, Sterling, sorry, if Sterling would have not built the South Gallery, it would have not been important, the other one.
No, I think the art of the lost competition, you have to go back to the avant-garde, or Le Corbusier or something like that will operate.
I mean, Koolhaas never invented anything. In the last 50 years, there's very few actors. I mean, come on, Herschel de Meuron, their work is not based on what they lost, it's only based on what they want. I mean, you know, and many more. I even forget that they also had an entry there. But so it's interesting. It's this kind of Don Quixote-like character, which of course is a copy of the Corbusier misunderstood architect, which allows to turn the loss into a gain, so to speak.
My comment about your selection of competition in the list will kind of go through the same lines, maybe. But not so much if they're French or not. I mean, there's the Chicago Tribune, or you know, there are others. But actually, they all fit in this idea of the heroic kind of international, massive kind of one. You know, this competition that is about one person is gonna, you know, shift it all, and it becomes also kind of a mystification of type of architect, right? Like probably. Kind of a soul figure, like kind of the fountainhead kind of thing, just having the heroic genius idea that actually will sort it out everything. And that's why I think one of the most important competitions of the last 30 years is basically Europan. Because I think that was a shift, a radical shift of what Europan. Yeah.
I mean, and now I'm teasing you, Urtzi, but I always had to think that Europan, that's the competition of the Spanish and the Dutch. I mean, only the Spanish and the Dutch did that. I mean, I don't know a single Belgian now. So.
Well, you did some.
What?
You did some. You entered in couple.
Wow. No, it's not very true. No, we have joined the team of 2 Swiss friends in Europan and Spain. That's it. No, but meaning that was half.
Okay, no, but what I mean, no, I don't think it's a matter of. It's not a matter of people. Probably Spanish for Spanish people was really important because it coincided.
No, I want to say something else. Because to me, the era of Europan coincided with the boom of Spanish and Dutch architecture. It became a Spanish and a Dutch thing. I mean, it's nothing to do with you Spanish. I mean, no. Again, it coincided with a certain logic and a certain economy, despite the fact of it being European.
I think what I will disagree there is because the Europan maybe was not so important for the winner entries, I will say. And like winner entries in Europan, there are some that I remember, others that doesn't. It's not so much about that, but it's kind of the decision of constructing an infrastructure at European scale. With I don't know if anybody of you have been involved in Europan, but for a chance I was, and basically it was not only about the 100 sites and all these people, but as soon as this thing is finished, every winner of every country is invited to a single space in which you spend 3 days, and basically you get drunk with a bunch of architects of all over the world, all over Europe, and you have friendships and probably boyfriends and girlfriends, and then you keep doing this thing. So for me, the Europan is not so much about how many projects went for Spanish and Netherlands architects, which is true that at the time was kind of the hype, but actually that they operate so close to what the Erasmus program was supposed to do. That is kind of dismantle certain notions of national autonomy of cultures into a kind of more mixed European things, right? Like to have offices that have partners from different countries, which I think in a certain extent happened to some level, others not. And Europan also ended up being a disaster. I think right now it's completely meaningless. But I think at the time, as an effort, as a competition, not necessarily as a result, for me was when I look at it after the fact, it finding extremely massive. Like in that sense, like Europe deciding that it's going to construct that thing. Again, probably doesn't belong to the list of competitions you're mentioning because really doesn't have a kind of heroic result. There is few heroic European buildings.
No, I think you no, I think that's a very valid observation. I mean, in terms of choosing these examples, I mean, it was most lectures did discuss the entire competition and the selection, not just the kind of the one image that we know. So it was really kind of providing, let's say, a broader context to break the myth of the one. That's just one comment on that. But I agree with you about the observation of that this basically opened up a kind of European project, the Europan, but also I would argue that now the repercussions of that has been basically the tender process, the European tender process, right? We're going back to my question earlier about consortia, coalitions that you have to build, that the new Delft train station that I have, well, I haven't used it in months, but that the underground, because that has the the Thalys line going through, has to be tendered at European scale. So then that's one architect. Then so it's this strange chimera, and then above, is the kind of Meccano project. So to all of the responsibilities divided up. I mean, in that sense, that kind of idea of kind of cross borders and exchange has also fucked things up a bit in the European context, where basically instead of enriching the built environment, it's essentially polluted it with all sorts of strange bodies or buildings, so to speak. But it's almost, I think we need to go. I think it's been a wonderful conversation. I thank you both really for engaging this now and for presenting and, well, in essence, ending the series for us in a very nice and contemporary and smart fashion, and showing, well, in essence, many great projects. And yeah, and it was a great way for us to end a very long final presentations week here, even though we still have a few more weeks of the semester to go. But yeah, thank you for accepting the invitation and for your respective friendships in doing that, and for sparking a very interesting debate that I'm sure will leave our students with some things, many things to reflect on. So thank you for your good citizenship and adding another Zoom moment to an already filled Zoom life. So thanks for that. And we will, well, hopefully see each other soon somewhere in the world. So thanks again, guys, and have a great week.
Easier for me than for this guy. I mean, I don't know, Urtzi, are you planning to come to Europe or anything?
I'm in Barcelona right now. I've been the last 3 months.